Hey guys, how's it going? KRIPP'S here. Today and in the next couple of videos, I have some Diablo 4 build guides for you guys. We have Season 3 arriving this coming Tuesday. It's only a few days away, and I've been hard at work theory crafting some of the coolest builds, and today I want to feature the one that I am pretty well known for at this point. It has seen quite a bit of love. It is the ultimate Firewall Sorc. Now, this is a build that I played in preseason. It is a build that I played to some regard in Season 2, and it has evolved throughout that time. And we have some new mechanics in Season 3 that I will quickly go over. One pretty important part about Season 3 is that we get this Seneschal construct, which is kind of like an invincible pet. And they said that it scales fully with your character's stats, but all companions and pets and summoned everything, they have kind of like their own attack speed, and they typically only get 30% of each stat. Now, with this, it'll probably get most of it like they say, but it's really difficult to gauge before the season comes out exactly how capable it will be in terms of its like AI actually attacking the monsters, and how all of the bonuses that go into this minion from your gear convert into actual damage. So one thing that it is for sure doing is it's adding certain pieces of utility to your combat toolkit. If you do want to see the written guide and you do want to see all the details of this build, I highly encourage you guys to check out the Mobalytics link in the description. We are partnered with Mobalytics. They are the home of the KRIPP'S builds for Diablo 4. So, how does this construct work exactly compared to what we have now in Season 2. In Season 2, we have vampiric powers that fill some of the gaps, and one of those gaps, pretty big one, for Sorc is vulnerable. Sorc doesn't have a great option for consistently putting up vulnerable, especially on large packs of monsters. One new change is that we get Lightning Spear that can apply vulnerable on a crit, but Lightning Spear does not have very good coverage. And with Frost Nova not having full uptime, fortunately, we do get vulnerable from the pet. Through the vampiric powers that we lose, everyone is losing a lot of damage. I haven't really seen it talked about, probably because most content creators just want to hype up the new season, but from my calculations, it seems that every single build except Minion Necro is losing at least half of its damage. That's because the vampiric powers actually add a lot of damage. While the construct adds a lot of utility, honestly, I'm pretty skeptical that it will double your damage. So I think there's going to be a power level drop across the board just because it doesn't look like the construct is going to keep up with what we lose from the vampiric powers. Nevertheless, with not a lot of new and powerful bosses coming to Season 3, a drop in power might actually make the game pretty interesting and challenging once again. My setup for the construct for all the builds that I will make, including this one, generally has a ranged ability and a melee ability. The way that it works is you have two abilities and each one can be supported with three like tuning stones. Let's just call them support stones. And I think there is some reason to use a ranged one and some reason to use a melee one. The ranged one is going to have a higher like on effect, which means that it'll be able to use it from range. The melee ones seem to have lower cooldowns, but they're melee. So your construct will have to walk over to the guys and actually melee them. So I've come up with a strategy where I think the ranged ones, you're going to want to support it with something that improves coverage. I like Lightning Bolt plus arcing. So Lightning Bolt launches a bolt of lightning at the target, dealing damage, arcs to other targets, dealing a portion of the original damage. So I think it's kind of like chain lightning, basically. Now, arcing support says the supported skill can hit 10 additional enemies. I am hoping that it launches 10 additional lightning bolts, but we don't really know because we don't have any hands-on with these abilities. But I think the general idea of having a high coverage ranged ability that you then support to have even more coverage is used to apply the debuffs that are either not applicable for your class or are difficult to apply. The breaking support gives you vulnerable for 2 seconds, and it breaks enemy barriers, which is pretty nice. And the dusk support puts shadow damage over time, which may or may not count towards Tal Rasha's elemental damage multiplicative buff. Probably it won't, but we don't know for sure. But regardless, it makes everyone affected 20% chance for their attacks to be interrupted. So it's kind of just like you just 20% attacks miss against you, and that's really good. That's kind of like a 25% more EHP. We're using the melee attack. The melee attacks, I don't believe, need like a supporting stone, like the arcing for the ranged, but we'll see. Again, I'm prioritizing just fast cooldowns, coverage, just to trigger these abilities quickly. There is a support that gives you primary resource when the supporting skill first deals damage. I think this is per target. I think it's pretty good. And the reason I have it on the melee is I think in some cases the construct will actually use its ranged ability right as I engage or even before I engage. And usually I need the resource a little bit afterwards. So I think it's best to put the resource on the melee ability or the one that is kind of like a secondary ability. There is safeguard support, which reduces the damage that you take. We don't exactly know the magnitude of this, but it should be pretty good. And this is one of like the unique tuning stones they mentioned. This is perhaps a little bit aspirational. The support skill grants you +4 to all skills when used for 2 seconds. So that's kind of the Seneschal construct system for Season 3 that we can expect. This system works really well for some classes that do have some gaps, like Sorc, like the Firewall Sorc. There are some pretty big updates to the Firewall Sorc, and they generally have to do with the new unique helmet, the Starfall Coronet. So Meteor now has 2 charges with an 11 to 6 second charge cooldown instead of mana cost, and drops 3 additional meteors around the target. The Meteor enchantment and enchanted meteor drops 1 additional meteor. So you get more meteors, which is why we use Meteor on the bar. And while the cooldown sounds like a bit of a disadvantage, you can get your 6 second cooldown to about 4 seconds while having cooldown reduction everywhere on your character. That's kind of what I have on my live character, about 35% CDR. So a perfect roll of 6 should go to about 4 second cooldown. The casted one is going to do 3 additional meteors, which means that it'll cast 4 total meteors on a 4 second cooldown. And honestly, that's pretty good. That's pretty good indeed. There are some mechanics here that I think are pretty intricate, but I think they're worth discussing. So we have it on the bar. It's a cooldown, and it being a cooldown means that it will now give us a barrier and other effects from the character. Normally, we use defensive skills to give ourselves constant barriers, but now Meteor having a cooldown is not always going to be a downside. For the sake of putting up barriers, it is an upside. And the stat barrier generation now works on the barrier generated from using cooldown, so that is also much stronger. The Starfall Coronet says that your Meteor has 2 charges, and 2 charges, they actually, one has to finish going on cooldown, and then the other one starts, reducing its cooldown. So it's kind of like one after another, but there is a little bit of a combo breaker here, and it's why we actually use Ice Blades with a fully upgraded Ice Blades. So the 20% of the Ice Blades cooldown reduction applied to your other skills. Now, hopefully Meteor works this way, but Frost Nova used to work this way, where each of the charges would have their cooldown reduced. So it'll kind of like double dip on the Meteor. So is that pretty good? I actually think it's pretty good. There are going to be ways where people are going to design these Firewall Meteor characters. Again, Lucky Hit Firewall works off burning damage. Meteor burns. And so you can get meteors from your firewalls, and you can get firewalls from your meteors, and back and forth. The way that procs work is a proc can't proc itself. So you can cast Meteor, and it can proc either firewall or meteor, but the firewall proc can't proc another firewall, and the Meteor proc can't proc another meteor. But they have great synergy, which effectively multiplies with Lucky Hit, and in the case of Starfall Coronet, getting an additional meteor from the enchantment effect effectively, that's doubling the lucky hit of the Meteor. Some characters are going to scale the damage of the Meteor, and some characters are going to scale the damage of the Firewall. In my experience, and I do have a lot of experience playing this build, I feel that scaling Firewall is the way to go, but with Coronet and perhaps some of this cooldown reduction shenanigans, it could be also a good idea to scale the damage of Meteor or to scale the damage of Meteor instead of Firewall. That is certainly up to debate. Another aspect that is absolutely up to debate is the aspects that you use. Because we're using the Starfall Coronet, because we're using Soulbrand, at least if you find one eventually, because we're using Tybalt's Will, because we're using S's, because we're using 2 unique rings, we actually are using very few legendary powers, so we're kind of spoiled for choice here. We're actually using a utility one, the 20 lucky hit while barrier on the gloves, and the gloves can use an offensive one as well, so you can use a number of damaging ones. There is a new aspect that works on Ice Blades. It makes Ice Blades have a longer vulnerable application, and it makes Ice Blades have a higher chance to proc vulnerable. But because the Seneschal is also proccing vulnerable, I don't think it's like a mandatory thing. However, the Ice Blades aspect also has 25 more damage to vulnerable targets, and that is on a separate line, which honestly suggests to me that it is a global damage multiplier. So, if you feel like your barriers are going down too often and your vulnerable uptime is like 100%, you can use that instead of conceded aspect. You really are spoiled for choice here. You don't have to use the disobedience that gives you armor on the amulet. You kind of have to if you are decked out in all the uniques, because there's no other place to put it with the pants and the chest slots already taken. But if you are missing a Soulbrand, you can put disobedience on the chest and use a damage aspect on an amulet. So you get a lot of flexibility there. In terms of the skill tree, there are a few changes here. We don't really use Firebolt very much. I expect that we won't be using it at all on an endgame character. We don't use Ice Armor anymore. Now, we used Ice Armor generally for the barrier, but Meteor, when you get the Starfall Coronet, it has a cooldown. So Meteor will actually give you a barrier now. So we can use Meteor instead of Ice Armor, which is pretty cool. I've stopped using Frost Nova last season because we had the more damage multiplier to targets that are moving. So that worked out pretty well, and honestly, after doing that, I feel like that's kind of the way to go. I like the idea of putting in Firewall and kind of running past the monsters and have them kind of get stuck in it and pelted with meteors. There are some suction effects with the Seneschals. You can get the raiment for the chest to do the suction teleport, but I wouldn't recommend it. There is fairly limited ways to get Unbreakable for triggering Tybalt's Will. You're really just looking at teleport, so you really want your teleport to be as low cooldown as possible for the uptime on the damage and resource regeneration of Tybalt's. So that's why I have teleport maxed out. I do go for Ice Blades. Ice Blades is a cooldown. I don't believe it's going to super significantly reduce the other cooldowns with the summoned Ice Blades, but you know what? A little bit can go a pretty long way. I really like the barrier duration. You can put more points in Meteor if you want. You can go for a crit build with Devouring Blaze if you want. There are a lot of options here. It's a pretty flexible build, but this is what I went with. You can also go S's Ferocity. One thing I will say is that X-Falls procs a little bit more often than Meteor, and it doesn't have a delay. So before you get X-Falls, you're going to notice that your Firewall and Meteor synergy is really strong. But after you get X-Fall, you're going to see that X-Fall is going to clear packs before the Meteor actually finishes falling from the sky. So you're not getting that chain reaction effect all that much. And while that might seem like a little bit of a downgrade for clearing, honestly, you're actually going to end up clearing a little bit faster with X-Fall. if you don't use Xfall at all and opt for a ring with like a damage stat, you're missing out on the cooldown reduction on Xfall, which is really good. And it might be pretty difficult to get a ring with appropriate stats, especially lucky hit is super important. But also, I feel like the main issue with the Meteor Firewall build has been and will always be single target damage. It's not like low, but it's not like crazy, you know? And Xfall in Season 2, I would say, was between 30 and maybe 45% of my total damage. So if you're not going to use Xfalls, your single target damage will go down. But again, I think you can play without Xfalls. Another thing to note is that this build in particular is considered the go-to leveling build. So while there's going to be another Sorc build coming up, you should probably just play this build if you're playing a Sorc. It is considered the best leveling build in the game. Firewall is ridiculous. Firewall synergy with Meteor is ridiculous. Now when you get like max level, you get a scroll to reset all of your points. So you can go full Firewall, get to max level, and then respec into whatever you want. So I hope this build guide has been useful for whatever build you end up playing on your Sorc. And again, check out the build in the link below. Thank you.